this evening. We hosted this event about a year ago, and actually it's just such a great opportunity for us to get together and ask all these questions that are, we never get to ask normally. So we're really excited to see how the evening's going to go. I'm Fiona and this is Andy, and we run Time for Marriage. Probably if you probably know something about us, but for those of you who don't, we run marriage enrichment weekends generally, and we do that across the country in residential locations, and also we run them online, and they're great experience of great opportunity to connect with your partner and learn more about each other, and some just great stuff for your marriage. So we'd really encourage you to think about coming on a weekend if you haven't already. I have to say all of our panel have been on a weekend, so they can vouch for us. And what we're going to do after you've attended this webinar, we're going to send you an email with more details, because we're actually offering two free places to one of our online weekends. So we'll give you a code, and the first two people to book a weekend can get in for free.
So check your email inboxes tomorrow at some point.
Indeed. So let's get into the nitty gritty of this evening. Oh, hello.
Sorry, just a little techie thing. I'm just going to have to log out and log in again. I'm really sorry, because I'm on the wrong device. So I won't be a sec.
So the nitty gritty of tonight, we're starting now. We're going to finish at 9. We are going to just plough through. What I wanted to say was that none of us align ourselves as experts necessarily. Becky naturally is a qualified psychosexual therapist, but we all do have experience of being married and supporting couples' marriages, and that experience of is what we're going to bring to this evening's event, and also to let you know that we're not necessarily going to agree with each other, and that's the whole point of view, is that we all have different views on how we should support marriages, on how we do marriage, actually, because we're all different. So we're really hoping there'll be some interesting and lively discussion this evening. So I'm going to crack on and get us all to introduce ourselves. I'm going to host the evening, but the rest of us are experts who are going to contribute to the conversation. So Andy, tell me what you do and how long you've been married.
You know that answer, but for our wonderful friends who are joining us, so my name's Andy. We've been married for 30 years this October, it will be, so that will be exciting. It'll be our Pearl anniversary, I believe. So along with Fee, we are the exec directors of Time for Marriage. I'm also on the senior leadership team of our local church, and I run a small software company, and that's enough.
Michaela, tell us more about you.
I'm married to Nick and married for 22 years, and I'm executive director for a charity called Marriage Foundation, and we champion marriage from the perspective of the impact it has on society. So it's not a moral thing, if you like, because we find we've got a lot more headway going for the research and data that proves how good marriage is. I'm also the presenter on a radio show called The M Word, which I co-present with my husband Nick, but I do all the work, all the preparation. I'm just saying, if you listen, it's all me. That's on Connect Radio on a Sunday evening. And I also produce and present a YouTube channel called The Relationship Hub. I sit on the yellow sofa, you can just see behind me there. So do tune in to that, that'll be great.
Steve, tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Steve. I am a church pastor. I pastor a church in Aldershot called Hope Church. I've been married to my wife Amber for 26 years.
Brilliant. And finally, Becky.
I'm Becky, and I'm a psychosexual therapist and relationship counsellor. I live in Derby, and I've been married for 29 years this year, bizarrely. Yeah.
So we've got a lot of experience and wealth in the room tonight, and wealth of experience. Sorry, Don't expect me
What's
to
that?
speak clearly, but
Got no money.
yeah, no money, but yeah. Anyway, so we're going to start with questions that have been sent in. We've got loads and loads of questions that have been sent in, and they're all a great variety, and there's some really deep, difficult questions. So we're going to launch into those, but there is still opportunities for you to ask questions. You might want to get involved and say, yeah, but what about this? You know, you might hear us talking and say, well, can you explain that a bit better? Please feel free to use the chat, and you can use the chat anonymously. We've got our lovely administrator Emma supervising the chat, and she'll see your name, but nobody else will. If you want it to be completely anonymous, you can still use the link on our website that you use to register to ask something anonymous, and we won't be able to see who asked those questions. So we don't know who asked all of these questions tonight. But if you want to join in the chat, just get involved on the Zoom link as well. We won't be using the raise hand function, just so you know. We won't see that. And we're going to do our best to cover all the questions, but as I said, we've got a lot of questions, so we're going to whiz through them as quickly as we can. So sorry if we don't go quite as deeply into your questions you'd have liked, but also sorry if we don't get to all of your questions, but we're going to do our best. And it may be that you don't hear your question specifically read out, but that might be because we've merged it into another one that was similar, because we've had quite a few on the similar subjects, because there are some things that are quite common that we struggle with in marriages. So we've made that, you know, a general area, and I think hopefully,
Sex.
Yeah, no. Hopefully that will be, this will be the start of some more, events that we can do like this. You know, we started last year, and we hopefully can do some more later this year. And then finally, I've got a warning, about the content. We are going to be talking about sex. We've got a wonderful psychosexual therapist here, and we've got a lot of questions that have come in around that. So just be careful about who's in the room with you, and know that there is going to be explicit content. So let's launch straight in. What do you do when you can't agree on a big decision?
Toss a coin. Always works for me.
So helpful.
Next. No.
Next question.
Okay, we go deeper than this, are we? Okay.
Yeah.
Crumbs.
I think life is full of big questions and big decisions that we have to make. And some of them are, I guess, they're going to be things like, do we move somewhere? Where do we, are we going to have children? How many children are we going to have? All of those things come up in marriage as well. And, actually we've part of the journey is learning how do we find a compromise if we can't agree. Some of the decisions are that a decision needs to be made one way or another, and other times it is a compromise that we have to work on. But I guess the important thing for me is that as a husband and wife, or as a couple, we are communicating and we're talking about it. Putting our heads in the sand is probably not the best way forward.
And also possibly, and you've got to be careful with this one, but if you really are stuck and just going around in the same circle, getting somebody else's to sort of help facilitate a different discussion. Obviously somebody you both feel comfortable with and trust. You can't just go off and tell your best mate and then come back and say, oh, they agree with me. But if you could find a trusted family member or friend or somebody in your community, then they might just somehow facilitate you going down a different route, or point something out that perhaps neither of you had seen, or just sometimes if you are stuck, just get somebody else involved.
I think as well, sometimes in marriage, somebody has to make a sacrifice and say, actually, I'm going to let this one go. And next time it might be the other one. Not that you have to kind of mark it down exactly, but that sense of being willing to give in the relationship, I think is a big part of it, as well as all the things that have been said already. You kind of got to work towards coming to some sort of decision, whether it's, the decision is agreed on, one person gets away, or it's a compromise, but you've got to find a way. But sacrifice, I think, is a big part of it.
I agree. I think marriage at its best is where you favour your spouse, and so you're looking for that, what's going to bless them. rather than necessarily always trying to see what's going to bless me. And if you have that perspective, that may provide a breakthrough into how you do it. So I completely agree with that.
Great. How do you share tasks? Is the next question.
How do you share tasks? Okay.
Yeah. So, do you have pink jobs and blue jobs, or do you?
You used to have that. Didn't you?
We still do in our house.
Oh.
Yeah, there are pink jobs and blue jobs.
And you do the pink ones?
No, I tend to do the blue jobs. It's true. We've worked it out over time, if I'm honest, and sometimes it has to change because someone's ill, or you just have to do it. But we sort of find a way through. And again, it's that communication, isn't it? It's working out what you do. And often it's to do with where the skills are and stuff like that. So for my sins, I am absolutely rubbish with money. So the traditional blue task of doing the accounts, I'm afraid, is not mine. And that's Amber does all of that, and she does it spectacularly well, and I would do it spectacularly poorly.
Yeah, I think it is about knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses, but there are also those simple things like who puts the bin out, isn't it? And I can hands up, I can sometimes get really peed off if I'm lugging the great big heavy bin out, and then but actually bad communication is then taking that out on my husband rather than actually saying to him, do you know what, I took the bin out, could you do it? And he'd be like, yeah, sure. So I think it's sort of, again, this whole big C word of communication, isn't it? And I've got a really great questionnaire that I've talked through with couples, and sometimes it is literally about going through a list of things and divvying it up, or having a weekly admin meeting. That's another good thing, because sometimes tasks change from week to week, but the key thing there is to release that responsibility. So if one of you has said, I'm going to do that, then don't think that they're not going to do it and that you've got to constantly remind them. Just accept that they've taken that responsibility, and if it doesn't get done, then it's their responsibility, it's not you, which is a really hard thing to do for some people, but that's what I talk about.
The only thing I would add is that I think in our house, it partly just depends on time available. So if I would rather do a task rather than saying to Nick, no, you must do this task while I'm sitting there doing my own thing and he's doing that, and actually I've not spent any time with him or something, I'd rather get the tasks done together by a certain time and then we have an evening together, for example, or the fact that I'm at home. So I do tend to cook more. I'd rather say green and orange jobs, because I don't want to be stereotypical with pink and blue. Let's, move away from that, those colours. So I do the green jobs. But actually just, thinking, well, I don't mind cooking because actually I'm home. He's not home yet. We can have a meal together and we've got time together later. So it's things like that, I think, just practical time issues.
What if it's allocated to them and they're not doing it?
I mean, so for example, I do feel we were slightly cliched, but that just works for us because Nick does tend to do the bins. But again, there have been, he's happy for me to remind him. And I think don't be fearful of reminding one another, because otherwise, like I think Becky, you were saying anyway, you kind of get resentment building up, or they've not done their job. But definitely there've been occasions where he's not been able to do that. So I will do the bins. And and that's fine. I don't think we have to be so kind of rigid. If one person can't do it for whatever reason that is, then the other person can do it. It's not worth having a big upset about.
I think the reminding thing is a recurring issue though, isn't it? And I think for some couples that causes a lot of friction where one person feels that they're constantly having to remind the other one to do things and this one doesn't.
For remind, you mean nag, that can be seen as kind
of
reminded you.
Yeah. So that's where, actually the dreaded sort of spreadsheet or really being particular about it is probably necessary. Because if it's really causing a rift between you, then that's not helpful. And actually saying how it makes you feel if they constantly forget, or how it makes you feel if you have to constantly remind them. Yeah, it's a partnership, isn't it?
Yeah. And sometimes you just have to do the job,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
because actually, yeah, it might not be your thing you want to do, but actually you just have to do it, and you just have to get on with it.
And just making sure the word is sharing, isn't it? And they are shared out, not always equally, because one of you may work full time and one not, but just make sure there's not the resentment building up that you feel that you're doing more than your fair share. So you need to talk about it if that is the case.
Cool. That's helpful. Let's move on. How can we change the atmosphere in our household if it has been overwhelmingly negative for a long time? That's a tough question.
I think the word change there, isn't there? I mean, something will have to change. And sometimes I think we think that's just by, I don't know, wanting it to happen, it'll happen. But we'd have to sit down and say, this is not, by agreeing that perhaps you don't like the fact that there is this atmosphere. And if you can both agree that it's there and you don't like it and you want to do something about it, what are we each going to do or do as a couple differently? What changes are we going to make to change the atmosphere? So
it's that, the communication thing, which will no doubt kind of permeate the entire evening, because you have got to talk about those things. It's, talking about the elephant in the room or whatever, the tension that's building up. Sometimes when there's a lot of tension, people then think if I mention it, it's going to make it even worse, and they're trying to keep going anyway. So I think you've got to address it and talk about it. I think choosing a time to do that as well, the right time to do it. If there's this awful atmosphere, don't choose a time when it's at its peak, when it's feeling really awful. Try and think, well, what moment is there where we're both a bit calmer or more relaxed to actually address the problem, and start to think through how you can, coming back to your point, Andy, about how you can change things. What does need to change? And there might be small things to begin with. Maybe it's big things. I mean, you often say start small, but sometimes it can be big things that actually you've just got to make a choice and, think this can't go on like this anymore. I'm going to have to choose to do it differently. But I think communicating, finding the right time to communicate what, the issues are. And depending on how big a deal this is, I mean, I don't know how big an issue, what's caused the atmosphere, but if you've fallen down a bit of a pit with this and you're at the bottom, it's going to take that bit of time to climb out. And I think, being patient and taking each step as you go and thinking, what if it's this difficult and we've fallen this far, it might take quite a while to step out of that, but be patient and persevere, I think, with what you're wanting to see change.
Yeah. I was conscious that somebody very wiser than me said, when you face a problem, it's quite often good to ask three questions. Is it me? Is it you? Or is it something else? And I think with some of those things, the kindness in a conversation and communication between you and me, as a spouse, that's really important. But sometimes these negative things can come from something else. That's got nothing to do with the pair of you. It's just actually another environment. So I remember, many years ago when our first pregnancy was lost, we ended up in a very negative place because of grief and just the trauma of the experience. And so actually that communication that you were talking about, Michaela, was really important for us to realize that actually it wasn't either of our fault. It was just the scenario that we were going through. And time ended up being the cure, just time to grieve, time to be part of, to put some space between us and it, that situation.
That's tough. It's a tough scenario. We had a question similar to that. I was just trying to pick up on that. Do you mind telling us a bit more about that, your experience, Steve? How
yeah, sure.
Babies when you lost them?
Yeah, sure. So our first pregnancy was twins, twin boys, and we were delighted because there's no twins in our families, and it was all very exciting. And my wife carried them to 23 and a half weeks. And as I said, I mentioned I'm a church pastor at the time. I was a youth worker, and it was a Sunday, and I was leading a youth service. And in the middle of that youth service, one of my friends came in and told me that Amber was about to miscarry. And so from that service, I got in his car and we drove to the hospital. And sadly, my wife miscarried, and I held my 2 baby boys as they died, which was a really difficult time. And we had to go through that, and it's still very painful. I remember spending a lot of my time immediately after that trying to comfort Amber, my wife, and she went into quite a deep depression, quite rightly, because of she was grieving, I was grieving, but almost had to put my grief to one side to try and help and support her. It took me 3 years before I actually let my grief out. And you know, that was a moment. But you know, our marriage was supported. So I talk about scaffolding. You know, again, we had lots of people around us, friends, family, and people from the church who just loved us, and they scaffolded us through it. You know, sometimes I've found that, you know, marriages need to be scaffolded by those at your community around you. You know, we don't do marriages on our own. And that was a positive experience for us. And it got us through that season. We came out the other end. And sometimes we just have to, you know, as pastor, I would say, you know, I lean into God, and that's important. But part of my leaning into God was leaning into my friends and leaning into my family, who provided the practical support that we needed to get through it.
Because am I right in thinking you went through a time of struggling to have another baby after that, or was that before?
No, you're absolutely right. So as a way of trying to, I guess, get away from it, we went on holiday. It wasn't really much of it was nice time in America, but it suddenly became the point of, we want to have another baby. And so we went. I suppose we tried for another baby, and that took some time, and it had a significant impact on our sex life, because sex became incredibly mechanical at that point. It became a means to achieve an end, rather than a loving experience. And that was hard, and that has had repercussions. You know, 26 years later, it still has a repercussion for us. You know, we recognise that and we talk it through, but it's you know, it wasn't the experience I was expecting sex to be.
It's tough.
And just tell us the happy conclusion, though, Steve, of your lovely family.
Oh, yes. So, yeah, I should
finish with a nice.
So I am delighted that we had a daughter after that. We then did lose another child, and then by an absolute miracle of God, we got twins again, which was extraordinary. So I have now got 18-year-old twins and a 21-year-old daughter. So I'm aware that God has brought a good end to that story, but you know, the experience, I hope, will be helpful for others who might be listening to this.
Yeah, I wanted to draw that out because we did have some questions around that, so I'm hoping that what you've just said really speaks into some of those questions that we had around. And
that's tough, that time when, you know, couples, it is a mechanical thing. It's not about romance or about being intimate with each other. You're trying to have produce something at the end of it.
Oh, there were thermometers.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
There were, you know, there was all sorts of gadgetry that was going on that I thought, well, this wasn't what the paraphernalia I was expecting in the bedroom.
And the only thing I've heard just people say is like to I mean, obviously you're doing it at a certain time to do with your wife's cycle and stuff, but just also doing it other times when it is purely for, you know, you're not, you know, the chance of conception are very small, but you've actually still got a time when you're doing it just because you're trying to be intimate and you know, and everything else. So that's the only word I've heard somebody say that was possibly helpful. But
I'm just coming on to some more of these questions around what you do when it's felt really negative in your household for a long time. And I don't know whether any of you've had experience of this, but we've got a question asking, you know, what do you do if you're no longer in love with each other? You know, what if that love has gone? What do you do then? Is it, you know, is there still hope? I mean, I think we've all got experience of hope in there, but you know, how would you answer that question?
I think it's trying to remind couples what attracted them in the first place. That's what we often say with couples who we work with. And there must have been something that, you know, even though at the moment, X years down the line, you're not liking each other or loving each other for whatever reason, that's drifted apart. So to try and come back to what did you first find, you know, attractive about each other? Why did you ask each other out on those first dates? Why did you end up getting married? What were those perhaps fun things you were doing when you were, to use an old-fashioned word, courting, that you're now not doing, that you might want to start doing again? So perhaps it's the active, you know, we need to do something proactive about our relationship, which you did a lot of when you were younger. You'd throw money at it, wouldn't you? You'd go out, you'd buy expensive presents, you'd try and go to the nicest restaurant you could possibly go to, whatever your budget would allow you, and trying to come back to those basics of the initial attraction was what
I think that's a really good point, Andy. And you know, that's certainly, if you've got those in the memory bank, then that's great, isn't it, to kind of focus back on that. But I think for some people, those memories aren't so great, are they? And so actually trying to rekindle something that they're not really sure what was there, or maybe they've just really forgotten and they've just gone through so much in their life together that it's just really difficult to get back to that place. And I think one of the things I might be saying is to think about what love means, and it's so much more than just that initial attraction. It's much deeper than that. It's about what you share with somebody, and intimacy, and what what you're doing, what you're talking about, and so I think after 20 plus years, which is what I think that question came from, you know, you're probably entering into a different season in your life, and so maybe it's good to think of it as a new chapter rather than just thinking about things that you can rekindle if you've been through an awful lot together. Maybe you've had children, or maybe work's been particularly stressful, or maybe at that stage you're facing retirement, and that conjures up all sorts of things about, you know, reevaluating life, and what that's going to look like if your identity's been in work. So I think thinking of it as a new chapter, and sitting down and talking about what you're going to do together, being intentional about that, and not getting too panicked about it. You know, don't try and romanticize it too much and think, well, I don't feel like that, and therefore I can't be in love. Actually, you know, as I say, love is so much deeper than just that heart flutter. It could be that as well, but it's a lot more to it than that. And the other thing is, I mean, perhaps a flip side of that is, this works if you're both engaged with it, which is what I think you were saying, Andy. I think, you know, you've both got to want to have that change, and if you don't, you know, I would suggest that you seek some therapy and go and speak to a counsellor, because if one of you has actually checked out of the relationship, you are just going to be in a cycle of trying to do something and it's just not working, and that's just going to cause you more distress over a period of time. So just be mindful of that. You know, are you actually on the same page here? Because then you've got all the hope in the world. If you're not on the same page, then it's a different approach.
Whilst we're on that subject, Becky, you just mentioned therapy and counselling. We have got a question asking, what can relationship counselling do for my marriage, and how does it work? So tell us a bit about that.
Well, from my perspective, what I say to people is that it's an opportunity for people to talk really openly with somebody who isn't going to take sides, who's completely impartial, because they're meeting you both for the first time. So they're listening to both stories. Sometimes I might see a couple individually for a session each, because sometimes it's easier for people to talk on their own, even if they've got nothing to hide from their spouse. It's still a bit easier to talk without them there. And so I'm just trying to get really to the bottom of what their goals are in coming for therapy. And the biggest thing that I say to people is that when you finish, you don't have to see me again. You can close that chapter, and that's a real asset, because talking to friends can be brilliant, and we're all advocates of that, but you can't unsay things. So, you know, and that friend knows you, so they've got a preconceived idea of what's going on already. So I think that's one of the biggest things with therapy. And just, you know, the tiny bit of the detail of it, we might look a bit at family backgrounds and you know, messages and narrative from our upbringing. So what we think about roles in relationships, what our expectations are, what our goals are, and all those sort of hidden messages, and then what you want to do differently as a couple, so in your own unit. So and in that encompasses communication, sex, you know, arguments, children, parenting, all of that. So yeah, I mean, I'm obviously going to be an advocate of it, but I think it's a great opportunity to really sort of perhaps even have an MOT for your relationship. We do that with so many other things, don't we? But relationships, we tend to think, oh, we'll reach the crisis point before we seek help. But if you don't reach the crisis point, then it's really even more beneficial, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's our experience with our Time for Marriage weekends. You know, it's good to just get those foundations in, you know, rather than get to the crisis point. So yeah. We're good big advocates of any kind of marriage enrichment, and doing it in a safe place, in a therapeutic environment, is brilliant. Thank you. That's really helpful. How can I best support my wife with her mental health?
Wow. Well, I've experienced it. So kindness has been the biggest word for me. You have to be kind, and it's hard sometimes, because actually sometimes the depression can be a sort of frustration. Things are out of kilter. They're not making sense. It feels irrational, and ultimately, this is why, you know, for me, it was this great prayer: God, make me patient and kind, and that's really what we did. And we had to talk through things like medication. We you know, Michaela's often talking about communication, and we had to try and communicate, and even communication was hard, because sometimes the depression just came across as being just always tired and not wanting to talk, but we had to sort of push through and keep talking as best we could. And it's long term. It's not, you know, this is not something that is 6 months and then it's over. You know, it's not like a broken leg or anything like that. It's actually, for us, it's been a lifelong thing. And you know, we still wrestle with it. And my wife has seasonal affective disorder as well. So winter is always a big deal for us. And so we recognize that, and that's part of our rhythm of life. You know, we do less in winter than perhaps other couples might do, because actually Amber just doesn't have the energy to do it. And that's part of who she is. And I love her in it, but I recognise that that's part of our marriage.
I think what's great there about what you said, Steve, is that one of the things I was going to say is about normalising it. And I feel like that's what you've done, in that's not to negate the seriousness of it or how much it impacts on a relationship, but it is a really common issue for many of us, you know, man or woman. You know, mental health is a big issue. So I think communicating about what help somebody might need, you know, too often I speak to people where, you know, they have a big issue about medication for some reason or another. Maybe that's just misinformation, or it's a preconceived idea, or God, you know, we should be able to pray it away. But, you know, the usual thing that any of us might say is that if you go to the hospital and with a broken leg, you don't ask to speak to a Christian doctor, and you don't say, you know, am I going to be able to, you know, have morphine or whatever it is that you need. You just take it. And it's the same with mental health. I think, you know, there's so much better advice out there now about medication, and a good GP will be monitoring that. So it's not something you have to stay on forever. But, you know, so that would be what I would be saying. You know, just be careful of what your messages are about help for somebody with mental health issues.
I think as well for me, I'm a classic, if you want to use a gender stereotype, they can be helpful, they can be unhelpful, but I would be a classic fixer. So, you know, times when, and that's been an issue with Fee, trying to listen and have empathy rather than trying to fix is probably something I've learnt. But also
still learning.
Thank you. All a work in progress, and I'm getting better. Please, I'm getting. Thank you. Getting better. But also not beating yourself up if you can't understand, you know, your spouse's mental condition, because often they don't understand it either. You know, and so I think you can get quite frustrated and be quite down on yourself that you don't really understand what's going on. But very often, particularly with things like depression, you know, they might not also be able to understand or articulate what's going on. So I think I had to sort of release myself from that sort of burden as well of don't fix it and don't worry if I don't fully understand it, because I may not be able to. So.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything else to add, really. Everybody said everything. I don't have personal experience in my marriage, but I think, like Becky, you said, you know, we're all engaging with people on one level or another who are dealing with mental health. It's something that's talked about a lot more, and we're still trying to understand it. And I think sometimes people pay lip service to understanding mental health, but when you're faced with it and dealing with it, it's another matter. And I think it's about, you know, trying to remain patient and you know, sort of committing to one another to give your other half time to deal with what's going on. But also, if you are struggling with dealing with mental health in your marriage, make sure you're supported, make sure you're getting help, make sure, you know, you don't feel like you're sinking and drowning in it and it's becoming too much. And if you are trying to fix it, like Andy was explaining, that you end up becoming overwhelmed with that yourself. So I think it's also just having your own mental health check while you're trying to support somebody with mental health, so that you don't both, you know, crumble in. So
that's great, thank you. We're going to do a bit of a change in direction now. Do you have any suggestions on how to manage money when we have different personalities? I'm a spender and he's a saver, and we can't seem to agree on budgets.
I think with finances, it's always a potential area for conflict, isn't it? Anyway, just whether we've got enough or too little, or, you know, whatever's going on. I think partly it's important to really understand one another's kind of backgrounds and upbringings and what puts them into that place of being the spender or the saver, just to really understand where they're coming from. Because, for example, somebody who doesn't want to spend much, it might be that they've just had their whole, you know, upbringing, they've not had much money, and so they're almost fearful of spending and fearful of what that looks like. So I think understanding why we are the way we are about money, and part of being married is being willing to shift and change some of those things, as well as looking at your budget as a whole and thinking about where your spending is and what you're doing. And I think when we were earlier part of our marriage, when we definitely, so just generally in terms of struggling financially and not having as much money. When I say struggling, we could pay our mortgage. We took on the house we're in now. My mum panicked saying, are you sure you can take this on? You're kind of, and literally we, like, it's every penny, but we could just about make ends meet, you know, but we therefore had to make a clear budget and had to make choices about what we spent and what we didn't spend, and almost knowing what you're going to spend on and knowing what you can do helps you kind of tackle some of those things. But I think it comes down to the communication thing again. Don't let resentment build up because one person is spending too much or the other person won't have fun, they won't spend on things. Communicate, talk about those things. And the other thing that, I talked about this on the M word with Nick a few weeks back, and we were recommending the Toucan Together app for couples, and they've got a money module on there, and I think that's a really helpful resource. So again, because it's finances, don't let that be the thing that really causes a rift between you. Find out, get help, look for the resources to try and manage those sorts of things better.
And also say to couples as well, actually do look at the facts of it, because it may be you think the other person's spending and actually you're spending more than they are. Perhaps, because they've gone and bought a flash item, but then if you're having a posh coffee and a Danish and something else every day of the week, then you might be spending as much as them, but it's like, it's under the radar, isn't it? So actually looking at what you are spending. Now, there's some great apps. You mentioned the Toucan Money module. Most of the online banking have really good apps now where you can categorize where the money's going and stuff. But it is that talking about it. The two things most couples don't want to talk about are sex and money, sex and finances. So it's having those potentially difficult conversations where there might be a bit of angst between you, but it's worth it, because eventually, if you don't talk about it, it does just build up, as you said, that resentment. And that's with anything in our marriages, not talking about it and getting too resentful is bad.
I'm sorry, Andy, I interrupted you as you were finishing there.
I've finished now, Becky.
I think one of the things, speaking personally, it's just come to me actually, one thing that Ian and I, my husband and I, we've struggled with this over the years, because I think he's watching this now thinking, what is she going to say? Because
leave him hanging.
Yeah, move on anyway.
It's because I kind of keep a handle on the day-to-day finances, so on apps and stuff, and he always jokes with people. He'll say, Becky texted me, what did you get 20 quid out of a bank for? Because it's instant, isn't it? But what I realized over a period of time is that he's got a much better handle on the long-term perspective. So, I'm very much in the moment and panicking and going, yeah, but we're going to be overdrawn, or, why have you spent that extra money on Amazon or whatever it is? But actually the longer term plan is he's much more in tune with. So, it took me a while to realize that. So we kind of balance out, but I think again, it's, communicating, isn't it? And realizing that perhaps, like you said, Andy, if you've got an app that kind of forecasts some of that, it becomes a bit clearer, doesn't it, about what's actually going on.
We will mention some of these resources that we're talking about as we go through. We'll mention it in our follow-up email tomorrow, because the Toucan app is really a really useful tool for working through all sorts of things, but it's got a really good, well-researched module on money. So we highly recommend that.
Hey, can I I just think it's important also just to talk about the people involved here, because it's all well and good throwing apps, and I get that completely, but this is two sort of people who can't agree on a budget, and you are not driven by your personality. Yeah, you can make a change. You don't have to always be the saver or the spender. You can work at it together, and it's sometimes it can be used as an excuse, but actually a budget, the whole point of a budget is you only have that amount of money. And somehow you've got to make it work, and so it becomes more about, as people, you've got to work it through. And yes, you might be a spaver, and yes, you might be a spender, but actually you've got to work it out as people.
It's true.
I think with Finn and I, we'd always agree about giving it away to people or organisations. It was the spending and the saving bit we didn't always agree on, but we used to both agree on, that's a good cause or a good, whatever, and that bit was easy, but it was, the spending or the saving.
I've actually just got a question come in on that, so let me just have a quick look. See,
it's almost like it's live, Fee. This is amazing.
How do you decide how much money to contribute if one spouse is earning up to 4 times more than the other spouse?
Contribute to what?
Yeah.
Perhaps the common pot, they mean, sort of thing.
Yeah. Because we've had experience of that with couples where you're like, one's earning a lot of money and the other one isn't, and they're like, well, that's I get to spend that much because I'm earning that much. That kind of.
If you're a Christian, you should start
Okay.
off with the whole point. It's God's money anyway. You've been given to sort of look after and be a custodian of. So that's you've got to go high level with it. That's what you might say. But
it's a very real issue. So I work with a lot of couples who perhaps in their second marriages, and they're bringing independent finance to that marriage, and they've got to work that through. And I think it's one of those things you've got to come to a common understanding of how you're going to do your finances and stuff, and that requires some difficult conversation. And it might be because you've got to support your family in that, and because you're coming from a second marriage. Now, I don't know if this particular circumstances is a second marriage. It could well be a first marriage. And then my experience is you just lob it all in one pot, and then it doesn't matter who owns what. You're a unit now. It's the one flesh thing that we talk about from the Bible. You become one, and therefore it's just one thing. And someone might have the skills or the opportunity to earn 4 times the amount of the other person, but actually you're all one.
I think, Steve, like when we met earlier, you said something about the generation differences, and I hadn't thought of that, because I completely agree with you. I think, gosh, if we'd looked at it like that, then my husband has always earned more than me. But when I see our kids now in their 20s and in relationships, it's a different entity, and they might, I don't know, it's a little bit, I don't know whether it's a generational thing, but it feels a bit more, I've earned this and you've earned that kind of scenario going on more, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all I can say is, in my experience of seeing it, those who combine their incomes and just say this is one tend to be in a more relaxed, secure environment. Those who, there's no danger, I think, of my sister actually watching this, I think, but my sister and her husband have separate finances, and she's 42, I think, but it's 10 years younger than me, but they're separate. It's their first marriage, but they just do it separately, and it's just awkward. It's just awkward, and they've got to work it out. But it's less awkward if you're just all putting it into one pot. But generationally, it is an issue. But you've got to work it out, haven't you?
I think absolutely, it's about your mindset as a couple. Because I perhaps because it's where I was brought up as well. But there was never any sense of, when we got married, never any sense of, what was mine or yours. In fact, before we got married, when we were engaged, Nick had a motorbike at that point, and his motorbike insurance was due. He also wanted to buy me an engagement ring, and it was all getting a bit tricky. So I said, well, we had no joint bank accounts, but we were engaged and we were committed to each other. So I said, well, I can pay for your bike insurance, because we're practically married, and so we are now sharing what we have, our resources. So I will pay for your bike insurance. And I obviously have to make sure I've got my ring as well. No, that was separate, I'm sure. But it was just this kind of idea that, so do you mind paying for that then? I said, but I see us already coming together as one. And I know there is this younger generation and change of mindset, and maybe that will be different. But I still feel as though, in the same way that our lives are shared as a couple, and every aspect of what we do is a shared thing. Not we don't do our own things, what have you, but just that the mindset of our resources, it's ours. And I think there is a danger as well, and I've seen this in couples. There's a couple who aren't married, who, in fact, they're now divorced. They were married and divorced, and she didn't earn as much money and did a lot of the childcare, bring up the children, and she never felt valued actually for being the mum. And I know we have more working women now, but she did both. And actually there was no value placed on bringing up the children, because she didn't bring the money into the house, and she didn't contribute. So the house wasn't really hers, it was his. And it was all very horrible and messy. And I think it's that mindset of valuing each other, what we contribute, what we bring to the relationship, and therefore we bring, everything to it, I would say, and put it in the pot. So that's
beautifully put. We're just going to move in another different direction now. Do you have advice on how to keep your marriage strong when your stepkids are struggling to accept you? So I'm assuming this is a second marriage. And we're looking
Just
at...
say it again, to read it out.
So, do you have advice on how to keep your marriage strong when your stepkids are struggling to accept you?
I think that's recognising what you're bringing in. I think often we like to think we're just independent people. We've got our own minds when we grow up, but it's acknowledging with lots of couples we work with of how much you were influenced by your upbringing and your parents or your caregivers, and you're going to be bringing in, you know, the stepchildren will be bringing in stuff from a different cultures, you know, in families. What things do you celebrate? Some families' birthdays are huge, you know, they last all weekend and you do multiple things and you spend lots of money on presents. Other families, you're lucky to get a card, you know, and if those two cultures clash, then that's going to be messy, and there'll be disappointment and there'll be frustration. So I think it's actually the communication, the C word again, of acknowledging what strong things you're bringing, what are the strong cultures you're bringing from your upbringing, from the previous family unit, however that was constructed, and what are the non-negotiables. You know, we must have turkey at Christmas. We can never have a joint of beef or something. That would just not be Christmas. Or I don't care what we have. We must have Christmas Day at lunchtime, not in the evening. And then to work at how you can bring those things together, and then what new things you can create. On Boxing Day, we're going to have a hog roast. I don't know, but it's a new thing that you're forming as well. But it's recognising, I think, the power and the strength of stuff you're bringing in culturally from your upbringing and from previous relationships and things.
I think it's a good way of doing that is, you know, I would do in therapy, I'd use a family tree, but you don't have to be in therapy to do that. You can do it yourself and just draw it out and see what those narratives are, like you've just said, Andy, and how, you know, talking about what close means to you. So, you know, finding out how people communicated and what those close lines are on the family tree. So who else was close to each other and why was that important, and what are your expectations of relationships, and things like arguing. You know, do you know what one person says is an argument, the other one says is nothing, you know, or where does that lead? So and I think once you establish some of that history, you can start thinking about what you're going to do differently in your own family unit. But you have to accept, you know, if you're going to draw out a family tree, you've got to accept that the blended family is all on it. So as you start talking about it, you know, you can use all different sorts of colours to try and represent things, and you can really start to draw out some of the issues maybe that are there. But it's a deflection from just talking face to face, that actually you've got a focus on a piece of paper that you can then leave and come back to it and add bits to it and keep the communication going and say, right, okay, I understand that this went on here, but for us, and on a family tree, you are the centre bit, you and your partner. And if you've got children, you're the centre in this family tree. The other bits, you know, other children aren't less important, but they've got other parents, so they're sort of either side. So, you know, how are you going to make it work moving forward? And what is the expectation about communication and time? You know, I think that's really key, isn't it? What time is spent with other children, and making sure that you keep those boundaries in place.
I think as well, kind of question, you know, how do you, you know, keep your marriage strong in that context? And I think thinking about you as a couple in that context, it is making sure that you do still have time together as much as you can, even if it's just grabbing a short moment here and there, that you keep investing in that relationship. Because if you can look after your primary relationship, if you like, that then gives your children, all of the children, you know, from both sides, the very best of you, if you can find that firm foundation as a couple. So just, I know, I'm sure if you've got children and it can be complicated to actually maybe find time or go on dates. It might be harder because you can't get someone to babysit and so on. But just being creative about when you can have time together, and, you know, being intimate together as well, and staying connected, you know, emotionally, physically, and, you know, checking in with each other about what's going on. So you really feel that you're staying really connected to each other in order to manage the blending of the families and doing the stuff that Andy mentioned about creating new traditions and being patient as well. I think it's a lot of patience needed, because it doesn't just all blend overnight. It's obviously, I'm sure you know that it's going to take time. So I think being patient as well with the process.
In my previous life, I used to be a youth worker, and in this particular situation, there's often two A's that you're concerned with. One is affection, and the second one is authority. And what's happening often with children or young people is they're trying to work out the affection, and they're jostling for affection from their spouse, from their parent, and they're also working out the authority. And what's happening there, and it's a whole new dimension. And so they're trying to work those things out. So, and one of the things that you can do is just help them with that, because it's the phrase "you're the adults," and you can help them understand what it means to be that. Actually, as a new couple, there you're going to work out what does affection look like, and is that going to impact the children, how they're feeling about it, but also the authority thing. So my wife, she has a stepfather, and she went through this when she was 14, and those were the two issues that she and her brothers had to work out with their stepfather. In fact, multiple stepfathers at the time. We've got a special relationship with mum, and here's this new father figure coming in, and is he going to tell me what to do, and why is he taking some of my mum's affection that is mine, and that kind of thing. So that it's all that's working out in their heads. So it's a minefield to navigate, but actually there are things that you can do, and I think what Becky described is really helpful.
It's all about security, isn't it? If your spouse knows that they're your sort of number one priority, then you're spending time with kids and things won't be such a problem. And the same with the children. If they know that they're loved and they're cared for, and they have a different place from your spouse, but a special place, and then they'll have that security to let you be as a husband and a wife. So I think there's a lot of recognising where's insecurity coming from, and what are the triggers for that, and if you can work on stopping some of those insecurity triggers, that might make things a lot easier for people. They're not vying for attention and affection and that sort of thing.
I want to move on to some questions around intimacy, but I've just got one question before we do that maybe we could just quickly have a look at, and it's at what point, age-wise but not necessarily, do a couple cease to be accountable to parents, and how can we deal with parents who demand accountability? I mean, good luck with a quick answer to that.
Okay, well, I've got a quick answer. Whether or not you agree with it is another matter, but we're not necessarily going to agree. Okay, Scripture very clearly says you leave your mother and father, and you are joined to your spouse. It is at that moment that your priority is your spouse, not your parents. The moment you are married.
And at that point, that the primary communication, if you've got issues or problems, should be between you as a husband and a wife. Not to go back with a problem or an issue. It doesn't mean you can't get good advice from your parents. It's good to do that and to keep a really good, healthy relationship. But as you say, Steve, something clearly should change in terms of the attachments and the priorities and the focus when two become one in a new family unit. So.
Yeah, well, I agree with all the above. I think that has to be a priority.
Yeah, agreed.
Can we move on?
There you go, quick answer. That was good.
Very good. Thank you for that question as well. It's a good question. My sex drive is lower than my partner's. I feel so guilty that I'm not always in the mood. How do we overcome this?
Shall I?
Well, I think we're going to come back to communication again to start with. I think actually talking about it together, and it's sometimes people feel awkward talking about sex together. They can feel embarrassed, or they feel as though it's just hard to articulate those things out loud. But I think when there's a differing sex drive, it's having the conversation to actually begin to think about kind of reasonable expectations so that you can both be on the same page. So you haven't got one person thinking, oh, we're never having enough sex, and the person saying this is just too much, but thinking those things separately. You need to kind of talk about those things directly with one another and talk about how you can actually address that and think about, you know, can we have a bit more sex, or can we just not have, as you know, sex on those particular nights, or just beginning to think about how you can both work within your differences, and again just sort of being patient with one another in that process of thinking that through. And I think it's, you know, it is always a tricky thing. And Becky, I know we talked earlier, but Becky will say, you know, it's really common thing that lots of couples have to find a way of managing how they sort of do that, how they work things out. And I think in terms of intimacy and connecting with each other, it doesn't always have to be sex. It can be being intimate in other ways. There might be other ways of connecting with one another that can fulfill some of that sense of need for the other person. And I think another thing, which this is stuff that I've learned elsewhere and I've heard people talking on this subject, but the idea that sex being a gift to one another. So sometimes we kind of have to sort of choose, not have to, but well, we're choosing to say, okay, this is a value to them. I'm going to give myself in this moment. And at times it means the person who wants more sex, they have to make sacrifices as well. So I think talk about it, make plans, manage expectations between you, and think about other ways as well of being intimate with one another.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that. I think, you know, the big thing there is to not feel guilty. I know it's easy enough to say, but, you know, it is a really common issue for many couples where one wants more sex than the other. And this is somewhere where there is some compromise. You know, you're in this together. So it takes some communication. And just a little tip about, you know, Michaela mentioned there about, you know, sometimes it's really difficult to talk about sex with the person that you have sex with. You know, it can be just difficult knowing how to bring it up and what you're going to say. So sometimes I suggest, you know, putting things into a hat. You know, or into a jar. So, you know, you each write down 6 or 7 things on little Post-its about sex, you know, and that could be anything. It could be something that you want to explore sexually. It could be a word you use for sex. It could be how many times you want to have sex. And anything like that, and you just fold it up and put it into the jar, and then you take it in turns to take it out and you talk about it. And most couples I've given that task to do come back and say that they've had quite a lot of fun with it, and it really starts to unravel some of that difficulty about how you approach this subject, you know. So that's just a little aside there, but I think, you know, you could be talking about how many times you want to have sex in that kind of context with that game. And also, you know, just thinking, I like the idea of it being a gift. And I think, you know, we can get a little bit caught up of feeling, you know, thinking about being in the mood for sex. And for some people, they just aren't in the mood for sex, maybe. But when they start the process off, or they start to feel intentional about it, maybe they do become more aroused and they do get more in the mood as they get in you know, going through that time together. So, but there, just raise that flag about foreplay. You know, what are you doing with foreplay? How long are you spending in foreplay? What is the build up for having intercourse, if that is the end game? You know, so for some people it isn't. So don't get too caught up in the oughts and the shoulds and feeling guilty, or feeling that you're never in the mood. So the always and nevers, you know, I think Steve, you were saying a bit about that earlier. You know, it's very easy to say that, isn't it? To believe that yourself, or to say that to somebody else, you are never in the mood, and that won't be the case. But they're maybe just not in the mood as much as they are.
That's helpful. Thank you. What about your advice for overcoming anxiety? I'm going to clump quite a few things into here, so, you know, let's kind of explore them a bit. Overcoming anxiety, embarrassment, lack of enjoyment with sex. I've got a question here about somebody who's experiencing pain in sex. and also body image, you know, kind of like embarrassed about their bodies. So that's quite a lot of things, but maybe we could just have a bit of a chat about that.
I can kick off a little bit if you like.
On.
So body image, I think I defy anybody to say that they think they've got this great, amazing body that isn't it wonderful. I think most of us will look in the mirror and find something that we're not happy with, or maybe a lot that we're not happy with. So, you know, it's an acceptance that bodies change as well as we get older, or habits change. Maybe we're having a season where we can't exercise so much, or whatever it happens to be. So, you know, go with that and accept that the lighting needs to be right when you're having sex. You know, don't have the great big main light on. Maybe you don't have a light on at all. Maybe you're under the covers. You're not going to be completely naked in front of somebody, and that's okay. You know, don't try and don't think of that as a barrier. And I think the embarrassment, I would probably, I mean, I've got a great book I can recommend that asks a lot of questions about sexual history. So just perhaps there's a bit of a story there about, you know, never talking about sex. You know, I often ask people where they learned about sex, and it's invariably never from family or parents. And, you know, it's at school and it's very functional. So they're picking things up along the way. So, you know, just think about the words that are used, you know, how easy or how difficult is it to use the word penis or breasts or genitals, you know, and people just get hot and flushed when they talk about those things. And yet they're body parts that God has created like anything else. So, you know, it's trying to normalize some of that. So starting a communication going perhaps about using those words, even when you're not about to have sex, just talking about it and having a bit of fun with it, I think is really helpful with that. I can't remember
the name of the book that you were going to recommend.
So yes, there's a book called Come As You Are.
Lovely.
The book, and it'll go up, won't it, on the yeah, it's by somebody called Emily Nagoski, and she also has done a really great TED talk, and it's mainly focused on female sexuality or arousal, and there's some really good questionnaires in there about your history about sex, what you think about sex, what your brakes and accelerators are to sex. Which is really helpful, I think, you know, for a lot of women, you know, they're really not going to want to have sex if you've just had a big meaty talk about finances. Whereas for a man, it just goes straight over their head. They can, you know, this is a generalization, not every man or every woman, but for some men, they can just go straight into having sex. So it's just being aware of some of those things, you know, and owning it yourself, not just expecting your partner to unravel this for you. Some of this is about you taking some responsibility for, you know, how you get over that embarrassment and what you do yourself in understanding that.
So is that a book for men and women, would you say?
No, that book is particularly for women.
Okay. And have you got any good other, whilst we're on the subject of good books on, because that's another question we've had, good book recommendations around sex?
Another one here, Fee.
Excellent.
So this is another really good one called Mind the Gap. These are secular books, but I think there was a question about that, not about Christian cheesy books. But of course there aren't, you know, there's obviously good Christian books out there that aren't cheesy as well. But these are secular books, but they're really, this is really good, talking about all the aspects of being intimate. So the psychological aspect, the physical touch, and you know, being in the moment, you know, time, you know, so it really encompasses sex through the seasons as well, and normalizes a lot of the issues that any of us face with sex.
Yeah, another book which I think I mentioned last time, so if people are joining in again from last time, they might remember, and that's Seasons of Sex and Intimacy by Emma Waring. So yes.
No.
Andy
I was going to show a picture of it.
of it.
Yeah, but it's gone.
picture of Andy's iPad.
I know.
No, there you
It's
go.
been awkward.
Yeah, it's gone.
Never mind.
Carry on.
Anyway, yes. So that's the book that I would
Yeah, it's a good
recommend. Yeah.
I'm going to pursue it.
There we are.
Well done, Andy.
Emma Waring. I've just read it and it's so good because it's got lots of general stuff. In fact, all the questions I think we've been asked tonight that have come in about sex, pretty much all of them are covered in this book.
Yeah. And that is a Christian book, isn't it? So that's good.
Yeah, loosely Christian, but very much anybody could read it.
Yeah.
And there's also some really in-depth chapters on specific problems, biological, physical, and psychological as well. So that's a really good book. Also for couples as well, it's very hard if you're not talking about it, and it is an awkward subject. I don't know why. We're all very British and we don't talk about that sort of thing. How do you start it? Let's sit down at 10:30 on Saturday and start talking about sex. It's quite without any. You say a book is good. You could read it and say we're going to read a chapter individually, then we're going to talk about it. There's also a great thing called Gottman Card Decks, which is an app. So if you just whatever place you go to, Gottman Card Decks, and it's got all aspects. It's lots of questions that you would then discuss. It's got a section on sex, and they are graded in chili peppers, like you get on a menu: 1 chili pepper, 2 chili peppers, 3 chili peppers. And those of us that are involved in talking about relationship stuff and invariably sex, we get quite used to talking about it and not that embarrassed. But some of the 3 chili questions, you'd want to be really careful where you're having that conversation, really. They really are quite... But as an app to sort of something to get you talking about it, Gottman Card Decks is interesting. We'll
try and cover all of these in our email tomorrow. I just wanted to ask... because we had a question around it. I hope you don't mind, Steve, but somebody's asking about the whole having sex when you've come through this trying for a baby for a long time. I'm just trying to... Oh, yeah, that's right. Any tips for making it fun when you're trying to conceive and less pressured? Don't know whether you've got any tips on that or any of you, actually.
This may be different for other people, but I'm just going to be honest for what it was like in my situation. It wasn't about fun. Okay, it was about we wanted a baby, and there was a particularly from Amber's perspective, there was this very powerful drive, and so we sort of recognised that it wasn't fun. It became, actually, this is the time of the day, this is the time of the month, and actually, I had to make sure that I wasn't running a youth club at that particular time, and you have to kind of make those things, and it was it. So I really don't have any tips, because in our circumstance it was there was quite a powerful drive. There that overrode that, and that I appreciate it was emotionally damaging going down the road. If it's your first child, or your second maybe or something like that, and you haven't had the experience of losing them, it's probably a slightly different context. But in our context, it was grief driven. It was, there was an energy behind it that was fun wasn't the issue. Sorry, that sounds quite negative, but that's just the reality of it.
It's how it was. I appreciate your honesty, because that's the thing where you think there's something wrong with us because it isn't fun,
Yeah, and we didn't, ours wasn't a problem of conception. Ours was really a problem of simply keeping the babies in. And it was twins, so there was a complication in that as well. But there just became this, it wasn't an inordinate amount of time before Bethan arrived, but it was there. It was a drive.
Thank you. I just also realised that what we didn't pick up as well on the last question was around pain during intercourse. And actually, Becky, I know you deal with that specifically. Can I just come back to that, because somebody's reminded me that.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a good point. So one of the key things with pain is to find out what type of pain it is, and and how it occurs, what it feels like. So there are a couple of conditions that come to mind. One is vaginismus, which is pain on intercourse where the muscles of the vaginal wall spasm, and it's a psychosomatic issue. So it's dealt with in sex therapy, and it's perfectly treatable, but it can take some time to reach a success. Because as anybody knows who suffers perhaps with something like IBS, it's not a question of saying don't get stressed, you know. And for some women, you know, pain can be on insertion of a tampon, you know, so maybe it impacts, or you know, sometimes women come and see me when they know they need to go and have a smear test and they just can't do that procedure. So you know, it doesn't just mean about sex. But there's another condition called dyspareunia, and that's described more like a paper cut type feeling. So it's like a sharp type pain. And sometimes that can be medical. So that might be a slight tiny tear that is causing inside the vagina or around the vulva that is causing that kind of pain. But it then can become, even if it's treated medically, as we know with a paper cut, you know, it's the tiniest little cut that can be really sore, but it can become psychosomatic if you you know, if it is sort of stays with you for a period of time. So there can be a fear then about having sex. So, I mean, that is perfectly treatable. I talk about exercises to do with using dilators, which I can show you some if that would be helpful. So starting with a very small dilator, moving up through to a dilator that's more of a penis size. And we go through that very at the pace that the client needs to go at. So, and often along the way there are blocks, you know, sometimes they make some real progress and then they might hit a bit of a wall, finding it really difficult to get to the next stage, using the next dilator. And that would be, a lot of that homework would be to do on their own. And then there are exercises that I ask them to do as a couple, which to start off with is a ban on sex, which might feel weird if sex isn't happening, but sex might be happening periodically, but it's just really uncomfortable or painful for the woman. So it causes a lot of distress for couples. So I would put a ban on having any intercourse, but starting with and gradually increasing levels of intimacy. So, you know, you'll be doing things with your partner that you wouldn't do with anyone else. But not necessarily sexual to start off with. So really starting very much with the basics. So you're still including your partner in the process of reaching your goals, but it's not going to include intercourse, because sex shouldn't be painful. So, you know, and the clear message there is that it's treatable. But if they are experiencing pain on intercourse, then I would strongly recommend that they get in touch with a sex therapist before it becomes an issue where there's a breakdown of communication, there's a lot of frustration and heartache, you know. It's a really tough place to be.
And sometimes it can just be as simple stuff about, you know, it's just not enough time spent in foreplay.
Exactly.
You know,
and you know, it's uncomfortable. They're not using enough lube. So, you know,
yeah.
Do you lubricate properly? Some women do very easily, other women don't. So why aren't you using lubrication? Oh, well, you know, some people say I didn't know about it, or I didn't know we could, or we should, or, you know, how do I get hold of it? You know, so, you know, more of a conversation about that.
I think this is a really good place to just mention, I know you're very busy, Becky, in your work, but you know, therapy is really, you know, groundbreaking on this for couples. So again, we'll put Becky's details in, and I'm sure you can possibly refer it on if you're not able to see people. But people can get in touch with you for some more help.
I'm really happy to, even if I can't see somebody for ongoing counselling, I'm really happy to chat to them on the phone and you know, just identify a few things and then perhaps refer on, or, you know, talk about that.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you. Okay. Another question. Is it okay to watch porn together if we both want to and give consent? As married Christians, it's a bit of a grey area.
I mean, it's starting off by saying that there's many dangers, which most people know about, but there are lots of very well researched and written about dangers of pornography, particularly that it becomes addictive, and you start watching. You might watch it a bit occasionally, and you might watch something you might consider as quite mild, whatever you mean by that. But it can be like any addiction. You want more of it more often, and you want harder stuff, and so that being very aware of it, if you're talking about it as a couple, it's always why having that conversation is something presumably isn't right in in the natural intimacy that you're experiencing as a couple, because that would always be the ideal, that you're able to communicate and all the things we've been talking about up to now. So it's almost like the first question is, why is there a need for something else like pornography? And what do you think the benefits are going to be? And if you think there are some benefits, also being very aware of what the negatives might be, because it might be one thing watching it together and you're consenting, each of you, to doing that, but then it might trigger one or both of you to go and watch it separately, and for that then to replace, because perhaps they're talking about wanting to use it to help kickstart perhaps their intimacy or their physical relationship again, but it may then backfire, and actually, because it's always going to be easier just to go and flick on a device and do a web search than go through all some of the complications we've been talking about to actually get into a good place with emotionally or physically, where you can be having great sex together with your spouse, which is ultimately what we would all want to do and is the ideal. So why do you think it's going to help you? Is there another way of getting that kickstart? And we just described some of the things in other conversations, but being very aware of where it could lead to and the dangers, because once you sort of start down that route, it can be hard to control it.
I agree with some of that, Andy, in the addictive side of it, and I think you do have to be really boundaried if you're going to use it. I'm not sure I agree with you on does that mean there's another issue or another problem necessarily? There could be, but because I think that it could be used as a way of enhancing somebody's arousal and sexual experience within their couple relationship. But I put up a big warning sign, but I'm not saying that I disagree with it. I think you just have to be careful about what you're looking at and agree with when you're going to look at it, and perhaps agree that you're going to only look at it together, for example, rather than separately, and agree on those parameters, rather than thinking that you're kind of going, it's very easy to go down a dark route with it potentially. So I think you need to put in those boundaries, but I don't think it's necessarily a sign that something isn't working.
So I'm gonna. We've said we're not going to agree on everything. So I think it's quite. I don't agree with the statement that it's a grey area. I think if you're a married Christian family, it's not a grey area. It's a very black and white area. You shouldn't be watching porn. I just don't see that there's any value for you doing it. I don't think that that is something that God would ordain, would want to happen. I think I've seen as a youth worker so much damage that pornography has done to people. I just, and we live in a highly sexualized society. So I'm sort of trying to work out, you can watch, and we conversed a little bit about this earlier. You can watch something like Game of Thrones, which is incredibly sexualized and incredibly abusive in its portrayal of sex sometimes. Well, a lot of the time. I've only ever watched the first episode and thought, I'm not going to watch this ever again. But as simply, you just go on your Instagram feed, look at the reels, they are incredibly sexualized, a lot of them, and young people are watching them all the time. And so it's almost like we've sort of calloused our way. And if we're sort of saying that this is a way of helping us find intimacy, I think we've sort of lost our way a little bit. would be my perspective.
Thank you.
I'll give a short answer and say, yeah, it doesn't sit comfortably with me. I think it has too much damage potential, and just wouldn't personally choose to go there at all. That's my view.
Okay, so moving on, what is your opinion on anal sex, especially if both parties are consenting?
Go on, Steve.
I'm coming back to I'm a pastor. I just, again, I see no room for it. I think I think I'm asking a question: who is the authority in your life if you're a Christian? And if it's Jesus and his word and scripture, and they're the authorities in your life, I think scripture is quite clear. And so I see no place for it in a marriage. There you go.
So are there absolutes at some point? So if we're saying, you know, that there's oral sex, which is you know, there's straight, ordinary, missionary position sex, as we can call it that, and then I suppose are there absolutes? Are there grey areas between, with the Christian hat on, you know, anything different from that, different positions, different.
I think we could get hugely theological about it. I think, you know, scriptures like the Song of Solomon seem to me that there's a very healthy expression of what erotic sex can be like. But I think there is an absolute there, and I think that, you know, that's as I read it, and that's where I would come down on.
It's a question I ask people, you know, any anal sex in your relationship, and you know, a lot of the time people will say no, and then sometimes people will say yes. Then it surprises me, you know, having asked a lot of questions before that, it surprises me that there is. I think, again, if it's consensual on both sides, which is key, and it's part of sexual play and exploration. I personally, I'm not saying, you know, when I talk to people about it, I wouldn't be beginning to say that I don't think it's okay, but I think that, you know, Steve and I have very different roles here.
Yeah.
So for me to actually say that in my context, it'd be quite difficult. I would suddenly have to only advertise as a Christian counsellor.
Absolutely, and I completely get that. Yeah,
that's helpful. We're going to go slightly over, just that I can fit one more question.
Well, let's not end on that yet. Let's just have one more.
Well, I don't know.
not a great point.
Oh no, can't we have an easy one, please? Please,
miss.
miss.
The easy one.
Please. Something uplifting. Great restaurants to go to as a couple. What's best, Pizza Express or?
I'm gonna ask one last question, and then I think we'll just end on a high in a different way. But this is, when does role play become unchristian, i.e., domination? It's a big. Sorry, I'm not laughing at the question. I'm just saying it's not the light question that you.
Again, it's a consent thing, isn't it?
Pizza Express, Andy.
Yeah. Okay. It's a consent thing, isn't it? It's about talking about it, and about if you both want to explore. You know, the brain is the biggest sex organ, isn't that? That's been said as a joke somewhere, isn't it? Pardon?
The biggest organ in our body.
Yeah, and our imagination and our creativity is there. So there's role play. There's role play, isn't there? But the domination thing, we're probably talking about, you know, dungeons and whips and chains and bondagey things, which, again, you're starting to go down a bit of a dark route. I mean, sex is meant to be about loving intimacy and connection, to get a married couple to connect together, share something together that you wouldn't share with anybody else. And so again, there's probably, you know, going to be an absolute somewhere where it becomes it's not about it's not creating anything. It's sort of destroying something. It's destroying freedom. It's destroying someone's dignity, someone's humanity, even. So, I think again, there's so many different grades of that.
I think inflicting pain is a whole different ball game, isn't it? If that is happening in a sort of dominatory way, I do struggle with that. But I have very limited experience of that, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's not something I think seems like a healthy choice in your relationship. I think there are other ways of having fun, having sex.
Well, I think we'll end there.
It's fair to say that there's loads of we haven't answered all the questions, and
I wanted to get through all the questions that have been asked specifically this evening, and thank you for your questions. I think the summary is that it's a minefield, of ups and downs being married, and there's so many different highs and lows that we experience. So we hope this was helpful to you.
And we will do another one because there is an appetite for all these questions. And when we send the email with our contact details tomorrow, give us some constructive criticism. It would have been great if there was just one of you, or if there was 8 of you, or
maybe what you'd like to see more of.
Yeah, less of Andy, more of somebody else. But all different ways we could do it, or creative ideas. We'd really like to have feedback. Is always good.
And thank you to our panel. You've been wonderful, and we'll send you an email out tomorrow so that you can look at some of the resources that have been mentioned this evening. And
thanks to Emma as well, who's been doing all the stuff.
Yeah.
Backstage. So thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the evening. Do sleep well.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all again the next time, hopefully. Cheers.
See ya. Bye-bye.